this panel, and thank you all for being here today. I wanted to just start with a quick anecdote. So I have a colleague who works at a small liberal arts college, and the college was having a vigil for the 9/11 victims, of course, who were killed 20 years ago. My colleague is Arab and Muslim, and her husband is also Arab and Muslim. What was interesting about what my colleague told me is that they didn't feel comfortable going to the 9/11 vigil. They didn't know how their presence would be received. They didn't know what message it would be sending. They didn't know if people would think, oh, those are the people we should blame, or these are people that are here with us in solidarity. Would they get uncomfortable stares? Would they be made to feel like they're otherized and don't belong? So this simple act of going to a 9/11 vigil to think about and reflect on the deaths of innocent people was not something that could be shared by two people who identified as Muslim and Arab. And I think that is at this question and this issue of identity is one of the things I think has been neglected the most in the course of the conversation and discourse on the war on terror. Namely that the war on terror has primarily and disproportionately targeted Muslims. Yet it's Muslims that are continuously invisibilized when we talk about the war on terror. I have been in numerous panels and have conducted numerous speeches where the context is not framed as one impacting Muslims, whether domestically or abroad. This is the case in liberal and progressive circles. It's also the case in other circles, right? So there's an intentional or unintentional sort of denial of the fact of who is this actually targeting. And when we think about how to dismantle the war on terror, we can't do that if we don't know in part what is at the root of the war on terror. There have been many times where President Bush or President Obama, for example, would say, this is not a war on Islam. That's true, because you can't wage a war on a religion. But what you can do is wage war on the adherents of that religion. And that has been the case, again, for the last 20 years. So I want to reflect a little bit on two speeches that were given on 9/11. One was in the form of a video speech that Biden delivered. And I want to just highlight a couple of things that he said. One, the world was changed forever. That's nothing new, right? President Trump said that. President Obama said that. President Bush said that. But why was it that the world was changed forever because of an atrocity that the United States experienced? There have been, obviously, numerous atrocities across the world, but those atrocities did not change fundamentally the global world order. Two, he said that we should not discriminate, or there shouldn't be mistreatment of Muslims, right? Well, he didn't connect or say anything about why Muslims were mistreated in the first place, namely state violence. We can talk about hate crimes, but hate crimes are a symptom of state violence. When society learns and sees how the state is targeting Muslims with impunity, society responds accordingly. And that's exactly what has happened in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. He also said that there's, he mentioned that we should never forget, of course. He talked about unity, which I know Kyle addressed in part, and of course there was no unity. A sick man, as most of you probably know, was murdered 4 days after the 9/11 attacks. And if that's what counts as unity, then I'm not sure what unity actually is. He also addressed Biden in his previous speech on Afghanistan, the costs of war from Brown University, which was great, right? It puts things in perspective. However, what is never publicly stated as the cost of war by the government is how many Muslim civilians and other civilians have been killed in the war on terror. You can't reduce the war on terror, obviously, to how much it's costed numerically. There are lives that have been lost. Of course, we know that when it comes to people in the military, that number is always made very clear. When it comes to others, Afghans, Iraqis, Somalis, Pakistanis, and the list goes on, there's ambiguity. Well, either they're collateral damage, or in the case of the 13 servicemen that were previously killed in Afghanistan recently, people would say things like the 13 service members and the others. Who are these others? They're people, right? And in Bush's speech on 9/11, he talked about this idea that the enemy hates us. Now, this has been a perpetual narrative, obviously, for the last 20 years, because that's the narrative that helps to sustain and support militarism. And we have to recognize, of course, what Bush's speech actually was. His speech was about whitewashing the damage he has caused, the fact that he was the architect, his administration was the architect of the war on terror, and any admission of that would bring him strong critique, in addition to the critique he's already receiving. He also said in his speech on 9/11 that there's little cultural overlap between violent extremism abroad and violent extremism at home. So essentially, he's just trying to perpetuate this problem. And I don't actually know what it means to have cultural overlap or not overlap. I actually do not understand what the cultural overlap in violent extremists would mean, except for if you're talking about there's Muslims and there are people that are not Muslim. So when I think about the war on terror, I think these narratives are so crucial to how we understand the way that this country has violently engaged in the targeting of other countries. I thought about how to conceptualize the war on terror in my forthcoming book. I wanted to understand it in broader terms. So to me, the war on terror has never been just about militarism and warfare. The war on terror is about draconian immigration policies. The war on terror is about surveillance. The war on terror is about detention and torture. And the war on terror is about federal terrorism prosecutions. This is not to say that the problematic ways that policies and laws have been implemented post 9/11 are completely new, but it is to say that many of these policies and laws have been shaped significantly by the national security architecture and context post 9/11. So what I've just laid out is what I refer to as the 5 dimensions of the war on terror. And if we think about those 5 dimensions, then when we talk about ending the war on terror, it doesn't just mean ending militarism and warfare abroad. It's much larger than that. And unfortunately, we focus so much on militarism and warfare, which is obviously very important, but other structures and dimensions of the war on terror have become so invisibilized that it is very difficult to understand what it would take to change the course of the war on terror. One of the fundamental issues is the question of terrorism, right? So obviously, as Jenny talked about, the concept of terrorism is very flawed. Along with that is the concept of counterterrorism, right? Because counterterrorism basically is a term to suggest, right, that whatever measures are done in response to terrorism are legitimate and justified. Because you're not doing anything outside of what has already been done vis-a-vis terrorism. Now, there's another question. Terrorism is not just about, the construction of terrorism is not just about who's targeted. Terrorism is about who inflicts the violence. So when Ilhan Omar was targeted a couple months ago because of her statements on the ICC in the US, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban, she received a lot of backlash because of this idea of moral equivalence. How could you possibly equate the US and Israel to the violence of the Taliban? Well, it's simple. Not that she was doing this, but in my analysis, the reason you can equate them, or measure them at least, is because there's nothing about state violence that is inherently more moral than non-state actor violence. There's nothing. And the reason why you have to keep it and sustain it as more moral is so that anything you do in response is automatically deemed moral. There was a speech that Bush gave in 2006 where he was saying something along the lines of, I can't believe people are comparing us to the terrorists. They kill women and children. This country has killed millions of women and children. Is that really something that separates the violence of the United States from the violence of non-state actors? Absolutely not. Then perhaps the last thing I'll address is the idea of the war ending and the idea of success and failure. So when the US troops withdrew from Afghanistan, Biden, right, of course, among many others, said that the war was ending. What does it actually mean for a war to end? Maybe for Americans who don't have to experience necessarily the visible and physical impacts and costs of war, the war ended. How did the war end for people in Afghanistan? Number one, the United States is still going to be a presence there. Number two, now they've been left with a country in chaos. And to be clear, even if the Afghans wanted the United States to leave, it didn't mean that they wanted them to leave on those terms and with such negligence. So we also have to, again, push back against these problematic narratives. And I think, yes, I'm going to wrap up. So I think when we talk about problematic narratives, if you ever want to probe deeper into that, Afghanistan is a very perfect and acute example of the ways war has been legitimized by this country. And so the last thing I'll say is, in terms of success and failure, I don't actually know what the metrics are for success and failure. Apparently, failure is not about how many millions of people had to die and get killed. It's not about the fact that a young Pakistani boy can no longer look at a blue sky and not be in fear that there's going to be a drone. It's not that a CIA prisoner who was killed in CIA custody died of hypothermia. His family was never informed, and still to this day, even though he was murdered in 2002, does not know where his family is. So is that a failure or is it a success? And there are many different metrics. Perhaps we can talk about that in the Q&A. And so I will just stop there and just reiterate the importance, especially of narratives, and really pushing back on and critiquing the ways that they sustain war and empire.